I remember the taste of recycled air on my tongue when I first arrived at Bastion 794, metallic and stale, filtered through centuries of machinery that wheezed and groaned like a dying animal. The transport had dumped us onto the landing platform in the dead hours of the station's artificial night, and I had stumbled down the ramp with 300 other conscripts, our boots clanging against corrugated steel that bore the scars of countless deployments. The sound echoed across the platform, a rhythm that would become as familiar to me as my own heartbeat, though far more reliable. Above us, the vaulted ceiling disappeared into shadow, Gothic arches supporting the weight of administrative levels I would never see, decorated with skulls and eagles whose blank eyes watched our arrival with the same indifference they had shown to thousands before us. The air tasted of machine oil and incense, a combination that burned the back of my throat and made my eyes water, and somewhere in the darkness, a choir chanted hymns of protection that were drowned out by the shrieking of atmospheric processors. The sergeant who processed us had a face like chipped granite, scarred by shrapnel on one side, so that his mouth twisted when he spoke, and his augmetic eye clicked and whirred as it focused on each of us in turn, cataloguing our faces with mechanical precision. He told us we were the Emperor's last bulwark against the darkness beyond, that we stood between humanity and annihilation, that our service was holy and our deaths would be meaningful. The words came out in a monotone that suggested he had delivered this speech 10,000 times before and would deliver it 10,000 times again, and the other conscripts around me stood at rigid attention, their faces pale in the sodium lights, eyes wide with the kind of fear that you can only feel when you are very young and have just realized that you are going to die far from home. I was 23 standard years old. I had been a clerk in a Hive City manufactorum, counting bolter shells and entering production quotas into a cogitator that sparked whenever I touched certain keys. Then the tithe had come, and the administratum officers had descended into the worker levels with their scrolls and their stamp presses, and I had been selected for military service based on criteria I would never understand. The sergeant divided us into squads of 10, calling out names from a data slate, while servitors lurked at the edges of the platform, their lobotomized faces slack and drooling, their mechanical augmentations clicking softly in the darkness. My squad was designated Echo 97, and we were assigned to the primary defensive line on the station's rimward face, where the void pressed closest and the hull was thinnest. We were issued flak armor that smelled of sweat and fear, lasguns that had been fired so many times the barrels were slightly warped, and ration packs that tasted of recycled protein and despair. The armor was too large for some of us and too small for others, the previous owners having been different shapes and sizes, and I tried not to think about what had happened to them as I tightened the straps and felt the rough fabric chafe against my skin. The lasgun was surprisingly light in my hands, its stock worn smooth by countless palms, and when I checked the power pack I saw scratch marks where someone had carved a prayer to the Emperor into the casing, each letter deliberate and desperate. They marched us through the station's corridors, and I began to understand the true scale of Bastion 794. The walls were stone and steel, covered in layers of parchment that bore imperial edicts and devotional texts. The ink faded to brown with age, and every 100 meters we passed under an arch decorated with skulls, whose empty sockets seemed to follow our movement. The floor was uneven, repaired countless times with whatever materials had been available, and my boots caught on the edges of metal plates welded over holes I did not want to imagine. The ceiling dripped condensation that ran in rivulets down the walls, pooling in corners where rust bloomed like cancer, and the air grew colder the deeper we went into the station's heart. We passed through hab blocks where other soldiers lived in conditions that made my Hive City tenement seem luxurious. Their bunks stacked 4 high in rooms barely large enough to turn around in, and I saw their faces as we marched past, hollow-eyed and gaunt, staring at us with expressions that held no hope and no pity, only a kind of tired recognition. The defensive line was a trench carved into the station's outer hull, protected by void shields that shimmered with a faint purple light and made the air taste of ozone and burnt metal. The trench was 3 meters deep and stretched for kilometers in both directions, its walls reinforced with plasteel and prayer strips, and every 50 meters there was a bunker where heavy weapons teams huddled around autocannons and las cannons that pointed out toward the darkness beyond the shields. The floor of the trench was covered in duckboards that sat in water that never seemed to drain, and the water was black and smelled of chemicals I could not name. Above us, the void shields crackled and sparked, and beyond them I could see the stars, cold and distant and utterly indifferent to our existence. The sergeant showed us our section of the line, a 100-meter stretch that our squad would defend in 4-hour shifts, and he pointed out the fire steps and the ammunition stores and the communication box built into the trench wall, its speaker grill covered in fungus that had grown in the perpetual damp. My first shift was during the station's day cycle, though day and night meant nothing here where the sun never shone and the only light came from flickering lumens strung along the trench on wires that sagged with moisture. I stood on the fire step with my lasgun pointed at nothing, my hands trembling from cold and fear, and I listened to the sounds of the station around me. There was always sound, never silence, never peace. The void shields hummed like a chorus of dying insects, rising and falling in pitch as they absorbed impacts I could not see. The atmospheric processors groaned and wheezed, fighting to maintain pressure in a hull that leaked air through 10,000 tiny breaches. Somewhere far away, someone was screaming, the sound carrying through the corridors and mixing with the omnipresent chanting from the shrine complex at the station's core. The water in the bottom of the trench made soft lapping sounds against the duckboards, and rats the size of small dogs splashed through it, their eyes reflecting red in the lumen light, feeding on things I tried not to look at too closely. The soldier next to me was named Tavik, a thin man with nervous hands, who had been conscripted from an agri-world, where he had spent his life knee-deep in nutrient slurry, tending crops that grew under artificial light. He told me in a whisper that the previous squad that had held this section had been reduced to 2 men before they were rotated out, that something had come through the void shields 3 weeks ago and killed 8 of them before the heavy weapons teams could respond. He said this matter-of-factly, without emotion, as if he were telling me about the weather, and I realized he had already accepted that he was going to die here. His acceptance terrified me more than his words, because I could see in his eyes that he was right, that we were all right to be afraid, that this place was where hope came to die. I asked him what had come through the shields, and he shook his head and said he did not know, that the survivors would not talk about it, that they had been sent to the Medicaid ward and had not come back. The days blurred together into a rhythm of shifts and sleep, and tasteless rations eaten in the few hours between standing watch and collapsing onto a bunk that reeked of mildew. We stood in the trench and stared at the void, and the void stared back, and nothing happened, and nothing happened, and nothing happened, and then suddenly something did. The alarms started during my 4th week at Bastion 794, a wailing klaxon that made my bones ache and set my teeth on edge, and the Vox crackled to life with voices screaming coordinates and firing solutions. The void shields flared brilliant purple as something massive struck them from outside, and I felt the impact through the soles of my boots, a shudder that ran through the entire station. The sergeant was screaming at us to take firing positions, and I climbed onto the fire step with my lasgun clutched in hands that no longer shook because I was beyond fear now, existing in a strange calm that I would later recognize as shock. Beyond the void shields, something moved in the darkness. I could not see it clearly, only suggestions of shape, massive and terrible, blocking out the stars as it passed between us and them. The shields were failing, sections flickering and dying as the station's ancient generators struggled to maintain their integrity, and through the gaps I could see things that made my mind rebel against their geometry, shapes that should not exist in 3 dimensions, colors that had no names in any human language. The heavy weapons teams opened fire, tracers arcing out into the void, and where they struck I saw flashes of something that might have been flesh, or might have been metal, or might have been something that was both and neither. The sound of the autocannons was deafening, a constant hammering that made thought impossible, and spent casings rained down into the trench, where they sizzled in the black water. Then they came through the shields, and I understood why the previous squad had not wanted to talk about what they had seen. They were approximately humanoid, if you did not look too closely. If you ignored the extra joints in their limbs and the way their heads sat at angles that defied anatomy. They wore armor that seemed to be made of the same substance as their flesh, grey and purple and glistening with a wetness that reflected no light, and they moved with a grace that was profoundly wrong, as if they existed slightly outside of time and had to compensate for the discrepancy. There were dozens of them, and they charged across the open space between the void shields and our trench, with weapons that spat bolts of energy that turned stone to vapor and steel to slag. The soldier to my left disappeared in a flash of green light, and where he had been standing there was only a smoking crater in the trench wall and a smell like burning copper. I fired my lasgun because there was nothing else to do, pulling the trigger again and again until the power pack was depleted and my shoulder ached from the recoil. The last bolts struck the charging things and burned holes in their armor, but they did not stop, did not even slow, and I realized with a kind of detached horror that they were going to reach the trench, and there was nothing we could do to prevent it. Tavik was screaming prayers to the Emperor, his voice high and cracked with terror, and somewhere behind me someone was crying for their mother, in a voice that had not left adolescence. I ejected the spent power pack and fumbled for a fresh one from my belt, my hands clumsy with fear, and I got it seated just as the first of them reached the edge of the trench and leaped down among us. The next minutes or hours or seconds, I could not tell how much time passed, were a chaos of last fire and screaming and the wet sound of things breaking that should not break. I fired at point-blank range into things that should not have existed, saw my shots burn through armor and flesh and emerge from the other side trailing smoke, and watched as they continued to fight, even as their bodies came apart. One of them grabbed Tavik by the head and twisted, and I heard the crack of vertebrae snapping, and Tavik's body fell into the water and did not move again. Another drove a blade that seemed to be part of its arm through the chest of a conscript whose name I had never learned, lifting him off his feet and slamming him against the trench wall, where he hung like a grotesque decoration. I backed away until I hit the opposite wall of the trench, still firing, my finger locked on the trigger until the power pack died again and the lasgun emitted nothing but a pathetic clicking sound. The thing in front of me cocked its head, studying me with eyes that were the wrong color and too many in number, and I waited for it to kill me. Instead, it turned away, dismissing me as beneath notice, and began tearing into another soldier with a casual brutality that suggested this was neither sport nor survival but simply function. I stood there with my empty weapon, unable to move, unable to think, and I watched my squadmates die one by one, their blood mixing with the black water until the entire trench was awash in red and I could taste copper in the air. The heavy weapons teams had gone silent, either destroyed or fallen back, and the only sounds were the wet noises of slaughter and the constant humming of the void shields as they tried to repair themselves. Then, as suddenly as they had come, the things withdrew. They left as quickly as they had arrived, bounding over the lip of the trench and disappearing back toward the failing sections of void shields, and I was left standing in water that came up to my knees, surrounded by the dead and dying. Of my squad of 10, 3 of us were still alive. I was one. The others were a woman named Kellis, who had taken a glancing hit from one of the energy weapons and had burns across her right side that exposed muscle and bone, and a boy whose name I still did not know who was curled in a ball at the bottom of the trench, rocking back and forth and making a high keening sound that might have been prayer or might have been madness. The rest were gone, their bodies torn apart or simply missing, and as I stood there trying to process what had happened, servitors began to arrive to remove the dead. The servitors worked with mechanical efficiency, their augmetic limbs pulling bodies from the water and loading them onto suspenser pallets, and they did not distinguish between the dead and the pieces of the dead, collecting everything with the same emotionless precision. I watched one of them pick up Tavik's severed head, its augmetic eyes recording the face for identification purposes, before placing it carefully with the rest of his remains, and I felt something break inside me that I had not known could break. They processed us, the survivors, taking our names and unit designations and entering them into data slates, and a Medicae servitor examined me with clicking precision, its sensors determining that I was physically intact despite the blood that covered me from head to foot. The blood was not mine. I could not remember whose it was. Perhaps it belonged to all of them, mixed together in the water until individual identity became meaningless. They sent me to the shrine complex for blessing and cleansing, standard procedure after contact with the enemy, and I walked through corridors that seemed narrower than before, past soldiers who looked at me with expressions I could not read. The shrine was vast and cold, its ceiling lost in shadows, and it smelled of incense so thick I could barely breathe. Priests in red robes led me to a confession booth, and I knelt on stone that was worn smooth by countless knees before mine, and I spoke through a screen to someone I could not see. I told them what I had seen, described the things that had come through the void shields, and the voice on the other side of the screen listened in silence. When I finished, the voice told me that I had been blessed by the Emperor to survive, that I had been spared for a purpose, that my continued service was holy. The words were meaningless. I knew they were meaningless. But I recited the prayers they told me to recite, and I accepted the blessing they pressed to my forehead in sacred oil, and I left the shrine feeling emptier than when I had entered. They assigned me to a new squad, Echo 97 having effectively ceased to exist, and sent me back to the defensive line after 3 days of rest that consisted of lying on my bunk and staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the station. The new squad was full of people I did not know, conscripts fresh from the transports who still had hope in their eyes and believed the speeches about duty and honor, and I could not bear to look at them because I knew what was going to happen. I knew that in weeks or days or hours they would be dead, torn apart by things that should not exist, and that new conscripts would replace them, and the cycle would continue forever, because this was what we were. We were meat to feed into the defense of a station that defended nothing, that existed only to exist, that had long ago lost any strategic value but continued to function because the administratum had not yet processed the paperwork to shut it down. The second attack came during my second week with the new squad, and this time I knew what to expect, which somehow made it worse. The alarms, the impacts against the void shields, the things pouring through the gaps in our defenses, it all followed the same pattern as before, and I went through the motions of fighting because that was what I was supposed to do, but part of me had disconnected from my body and watched from a distance as I fired my lasgun and saw people die around me. The new squad fought well, all things considered, but they died just as quickly as the old one had, their training and their faith and their youth meaning nothing when confronted with enemies that defied understanding. This time I was not passive in my survival. I fought and moved and killed, but my survival felt arbitrary, as if some unseen force was deliberately keeping me alive for reasons I could not fathom. After the second attack, they promoted me. It was not a reward. I understood that immediately. It was logistics. They needed sergeants, because the sergeant corps had attrition rates that made the regular conscripts' survival rates look optimistic, and I had survived 2 attacks, which made me qualified by the standards of Bastion 794. They gave me a slightly better uniform, a data slate for recording casualties, and a squad of 10 conscripts who looked at me with something like hope because I had survived, and maybe that meant they could too. I wanted to tell them that survival was random, that it meant nothing, that I had done nothing special, and that they should not look to me for salvation. Instead, I gave them the same speech the sergeant had given me when I arrived, the words about duty and honor and the Emperor's protection, and I watched their faces as they believed me, because they needed to believe something. Time began to lose meaning in a way it had not before. The attacks came irregularly, sometimes weeks apart, sometimes days, and between attacks we stood in the trench and stared at the void, and slowly went mad from the monotony and the fear. I learned to recognize the signs of mental breakdown in my squad members, the 1,000-yard stare, the muttering of prayers that became increasingly incoherent, the sudden violent outbursts that were quickly suppressed by the commissariat officers who prowled the defensive lines looking for cowardice or heresy. I learned to write death reports in the prescribed format, learned the proper way to catalogue equipment lost in combat, learned how to request replacement personnel through channels that took weeks to process requests that needed to be filled immediately. I became efficient at these tasks. I took no pride in my efficiency. The station itself began to feel like a living thing, a massive beast that had swallowed us and was slowly digesting us in its mechanical bowels. The corridors all looked the same, Gothic arches and skulls and dripping condensation, and I began to suspect that we were walking in circles, that the station was larger on the inside than the outside, that its geometry did not quite make sense. The shrine complex seemed to move, sometimes close enough that I could hear the chanting clearly, sometimes so distant that the sound was barely a whisper. The rats grew bolder, and I saw soldiers setting traps for them and eating what they caught, because the ration supplies had become irregular, and hunger was a constant companion. The water in the trench grew deeper, coming up to our waists in places, and things swam in it that were not rats, pale and eyeless things that nibbled at our boots when we stood still too long. I was standing watch during the station's night cycle, the 3rd month of my deployment, or maybe the 4th. I had stopped keeping precise track when I realized that I could no longer remember what my life had been like before Bastion 794. I knew intellectually that I had lived in a hive city, had worked in a manufactorum, had counted bolter shells, and entered data into cogitators, but I could not visualize it, could not remember the faces of the people I had worked with, or the route I had walked from my HAB unit to the factory floor. My past had become abstract, a series of facts without emotional content, and I understood with a kind of numb horror that the station was consuming not just my future but my history, erasing me piece by piece, until there would be nothing left but a collection of functions and reports and casualty statistics. The Vox crackled, and a voice informed me that I was being reassigned to the inner defense ring, a promotion that was not a promotion, and I was to report to the mustering area immediately. I climbed out of the trench, leaving my squad behind with a corporal who looked too young to shave, and I followed the directions through corridors that seemed to stretch and compress as I walked. The inner defense ring was deeper in the station, closer to the core, and it was defended by veterans who had survived months or years of deployment, their faces scarred and their eyes dead, and they looked at me without interest as I joined their ranks. The defensive positions here were not trenches but bunkers built into the station's structure, and the walls were thick enough that the sounds of combat from the outer rings came through muffled and distant, like the memory of violence rather than violence itself. The attacks at this level were different. The things that made it through the outer defenses were faster, smarter, and far more dangerous, and they came in smaller numbers, but with greater purpose. We fought them in the corridors, in close quarters, where my lasgun was almost useless, and combat devolved into brutal melee with bayonets and entrenching tools and fists. I killed with a mechanical precision that frightened me, stabbing and smashing and tearing without thought or emotion, and afterward I would find my hands trembling, and my uniform soaked with blood, and no memory of the individual moments of violence, only the results. The veteran soldiers taught me techniques for killing that were not in any training manual, methods that exploited the anatomical weaknesses of our enemies, and I learned them with the same detachment I had once used to learn accounting procedures. I was promoted again, to lieutenant this time, and given responsibility for an entire defense sector that included 3 bunker complexes and 200 soldiers. The promotion came with access to better rations and a private sleeping chamber, luxuries that would have seemed incredible 3 months ago, but now felt like cruel jokes. The private chamber was 3 meters by 2, its walls covered in scratches where previous occupants had carved prayers or curses, or simply marks to count the days, and it smelled of old sweat and new despair. I slept there when I could sleep, which was rarely, plagued by dreams of things coming through the void shields, of Tavik's head being collected by servitors, of my own face, carved into the wall by some future occupant who would wonder who I had been. The command staff called me to briefings in rooms that were surprisingly comfortable, with functioning climate control and chairs that were merely worn rather than actively falling apart, and they showed me maps of the station that made no sense, with sections that appeared and disappeared between briefings, with corridors that led to places that should not exist. They spoke about strategic objectives and defensive priorities and acceptable casualty rates, and I realized that they were as trapped as the rest of us, that their rank merely gave them a different perspective on our shared imprisonment. A colonel with augmetic legs told me that Bastion 794 was critical to the defense of an entire sector, that if we fell then hundreds of worlds would be exposed to invasion, and I saw in his eyes that he knew this was not true, that the station defended nothing and that we were dying for bureaucratic inertia rather than strategic necessity. The attacks escalated. Where before they had come every few days or weeks, now they came daily, and the periods of respite between them grew shorter until we were in a state of nearly constant combat. The void shields failed more frequently, and the repair crews could not keep up with the damage, and sections of the station were simply abandoned as untenable. The soldiers who had defended them pulled back to secondary positions or left to die if the retreat could not be organized quickly enough. I signed death certificates for people I'd never met, certified the loss of equipment I'd never seen, and sent reports up the chain of command that I knew would never be read. The data slate they had given me when I was promoted to sergeant was filled with names, thousands of them, and sometimes I would scroll through the list and try to remember faces to match the names and fail to recall even one. The shrine complex expanded. I noticed it during one of the rare moments when I had to travel across the station to attend a briefing, that the shrines were taking up more space, encroaching on areas that had been hab blocks or storage chambers. The priests were everywhere, leading prayers and conducting blessings and whispering about faith and sacrifice, and I saw soldiers who had been hardened veterans break down in tears at the shrines, begging for salvation that would never come. The chanting was constant now, not just from the central complex but from smaller shrines that had sprouted throughout the station like fungus, and the words were in languages I did not understand, rhythmic and hypnotic and deeply unsettling. I asked another officer about the expansion of the shrines, and he looked at me with the flat effect of someone who had already gone mad and said that we needed more prayers because the Emperor was not listening anymore. My hands started shaking during the 6th month, a fine tremor that I could not control, and the Medicae orderly who examined me said it was combat fatigue and gave me pills that tasted like ash and made my thoughts slow and distant. I took them because the alternative was being declared unfit for duty, and I had seen what happened to soldiers who were declared unfit, how they were sent to penal battalions that defended the most exposed positions with no support and no hope. The pills helped with the shaking but made everything else worse, made the world feel like it was wrapped in gauze, made the sounds of combat come from very far away even when I was in the middle of it. I stopped taking them after a week and dealt with the shaking by clenching my fists until my nails drew blood from my palms. They brought me new troops, replacements for the replacements for the replacements, and I saw that they were younger than before, some of them barely old enough to hold a lasgun steady. The tithe was scraping the bottom of available conscripts, pulling children from scolums and the elderly from retirement habitats, and I was sending them into combat against things that terrified trained soldiers. I tried to keep them alive through better tactics, through smarter deployment of resources, through anything I could think of, and they died anyway because death was the only constant on Bastion 794, and I was a fool to think I could change that. A boy of perhaps 14 died in my arms after taking an energy bolt to the chest, his last words asking if he had served the Emperor well, and I told him yes, because it cost nothing to lie to the dying and everything to tell them the truth. The station began to change in ways that were not physical. The air felt heavier, charged with something I could not name, and sometimes I would see things from the corner of my eye that were not there when I turned to look directly at them. The shadows seemed darker, more solid, and they moved independently of their light sources, pooling in corners and flowing down corridors like liquid. Other soldiers noticed it too. I could tell from their nervous glances and the way they clustered together in groups, but no one spoke about it, because speaking about it would make it real in a way that silence did not. The priests intensified their rituals, sprinkling holy water and wafting incense through the corridors, and they spoke in hushed voices about spiritual corruption and the need for vigilance against the unseen enemy. I was called to a briefing with the station's commanding officer, a general whose name I never learned, and whose face I could not remember, even while standing in front of him, and he told me that I was being given command of an assault force to retake sections of the outer defense ring that had been overrun. The assignment was suicide. We both knew it, but he gave the orders anyway, and I accepted them, because that was the function we both served, him to issue orders that would kill people, and me to follow orders that would kill me. He gave me 100 soldiers, and told me that reinforcements would follow if we secured the objectives, and I knew the reinforcements would never come because the entire station was collapsing and there were no reserves left to commit. We went into the lost sections with lasguns and flamers and faith that felt increasingly hollow, and we found them changed in ways that defied description. The corridors had twisted, their walls no longer meeting at right angles, and the lighting was wrong, casting shadows that were darker than the surrounding darkness. There were bodies, or things that had been bodies once, merged with the walls and floor in configurations that suggested they had been alive when it happened, their faces frozen in expressions of terminal agony. We advanced through this nightmare, clearing rooms and corridors with mechanical precision, and we found nothing living but felt constantly watched by eyes we could not see. The soldiers with me were breaking. I could see it in their movements and hear it in their voices, but we continued, because turning back was not an option that had been offered. The enemy found us in a chamber that had once been a barracks, and was now something else, its dimensions wrong, its ceiling too high, and its walls too close. They came from everywhere and nowhere, materializing out of the shadows with their grotesque grace, and we fought them in close quarters, where every advantage we might have had disappeared. The flamers were effective. I will give them that, turning the things into shrieking torches that ran blindly until they collapsed. But there were too many, and we were too few. I fought with my las pistol in one hand and a combat knife in the other, killing and being spattered with substances that burned my skin, and I felt the soldiers around me dying, felt their lives snuffed out one by one until I was alone in the dark with things that should not exist. I do not remember how I escaped. I have fragments of memory, running through corridors that shifted around me, climbing over bodies that might have been human or might not, finding myself somehow back in the inner defense ring with no clear recollection of the route I took. I was covered in blood and other fluids, my uniform torn, my weapons lost somewhere in the darkness, and when the sentries found me I was laughing, high and cracked, because I had survived again, and my survival was becoming obscene. They took me to the Medicae ward, and they sedated me, and I woke up on a cot in a room full of other soldiers who had broken in various ways, and I lay there listening to their screams and prayers and realized that I could not feel anything anymore, that something fundamental inside me had been excised, and I was now just a collection of responses to external stimuli. They sent me back to duty after a week, declared fit for service by a Medicae officer who barely looked at me, and I returned to my command position in the inner defense ring. The soldiers I had led into the lost sections were all listed as casualties, their bodies unrecovered, their equipment written off as lost. I filed the reports with the same mechanical precision I had learned to apply to everything, and I did not feel grief or anger or anything at all. I was becoming what the station wanted me to become, an efficient processor of violence and death, stripped of everything that made me human until only function remained. I thought sometimes about the clerk I had been in the Hive City Manufactorum, counting bolter shells and entering production quotas, and that person seemed impossibly distant, might as well have been someone else entirely, might never have existed at all. The station was dying. I understood this now in a way I had not before. It was not dying the way living things die, but the way systems die, through accumulated failures and cascading breakdowns that fed on themselves in ever-accelerating cycles. The void shields were failing more often than they functioned. The atmospheric processors were running at partial capacity. The food synthesizers were breaking down faster than they could be repaired. The water that collected in the trenches and corridors was rising, and I learned that it came from condensation that the drainage systems could no longer handle. Thousands of liters of liquid that pooled in the lowest levels and turned everything into a bog. Soldiers were developing infections from standing in the water, their feet rotting inside their boots, and the Medicae wards were full of people dying from diseases that should have been easily treatable, but were running rampant because the medical supplies had been diverted to other stations deemed more strategically important. The attacks continued, but they felt different now, almost perfunctory, as if the enemy knew that they did not need to destroy us because we were destroying ourselves. They came in smaller numbers, probing our defenses, killing a few dozen soldiers and withdrawing, and I began to suspect that they were studying us, learning our weaknesses, preparing for something larger. The command staff was in denial, issuing orders about maintaining defensive integrity and holding the line, but I could see the panic in their eyes during briefings, could hear the desperation in their voices when they spoke about reinforcements that were always coming but never arrived. The general I had met once was gone, evacuated or dead or simply vanished, and his replacement was a colonel who looked barely older than me and who drank heavily during briefings, the smell of amasec on his breath, mixing with the incense that permeated everything. I was promoted again, to captain now, and given command of an entire defensive sector that included 6 bunker complexes and 500 soldiers. The promotion was meaningless, just more names to add to casualty reports, more equipment to catalogue as lost, more death certificates to sign. I moved through my duties like a servitor, my actions predetermined by protocols I followed without thought, and I spoke to my subordinate officers in the same monotone the sergeant had used when I arrived, and I saw in their faces the same fear I had felt then but could no longer access. They asked me questions about survival, about tactics, about whether the Emperor truly protected the faithful, and I gave them answers that were technically accurate but spiritually empty, and I watched them cling to these answers, because humans need meaning, even when no meaning exists. The shrine complex had become the heart of the station. More and more soldiers were spending their off-duty time there, praying and confessing, and seeking absolution for sins they had not committed but felt anyway. The priests encouraged this, their numbers swelling as they recruited from the ranks, and I saw soldiers I had commanded abandon their posts to join the priesthood, trading one form of futile service for another. The rituals grew stranger, involving self-flagellation and blood offerings and prayers in languages that hurt to hear, and sometimes I would walk past a shrine and see things that did not quite make sense, figures that were too tall or too thin, or that moved in ways that suggested too many joints. I reported these observations through proper channels, and my reports were acknowledged and filed, and nothing changed. During the 9th month, or perhaps the 10th, the power failed. Not completely, but in rolling blackouts that plunged sections of the station into absolute darkness for hours at a time. And in the darkness things moved that did not move when the lights were on. Soldiers disappeared, sentries vanishing from their posts with no signs of struggle, and we would find their equipment abandoned, their weapons unfired, as if they had simply decided to walk away from their duty and dissolve into the shadows. The command staff ordered increased patrols and stricter discipline, and the commissariat executed soldiers for dereliction of duty. But the disappearances continued, and we all knew that discipline and bullets could not solve a problem that was not fundamentally human. I stopped sleeping. This was not insomnia in the conventional sense, but rather a decision, conscious or unconscious I could not tell, that sleep was a vulnerability I could no longer afford. I would lie on my bunk during rest periods with my eyes closed, achieving something like rest without ever losing consciousness, and I would listen to the sounds of the station around me and catalogue them in my mind. The rhythm of the atmospheric processes, 37 cycles per minute. the dripping of condensation from the ceiling, irregular, but averaging 4 drops per minute. The distant sound of chanting from the shrine complex, constant and unchanging. The occasional scream from somewhere in the darkness, quickly cut off. These sounds became my reality, more concrete than the sight of my own hands, or the taste of food, or the feeling of cold metal against my skin. The enemy came through the void shields in force during what should have been the station's day cycle, though the distinction had become meaningless because the lighting was failing, and large sections of Bastion 794 were in permanent twilight. They came in numbers I had never seen before, hundreds or thousands of them, and they did not just attack the defensive lines but poured into the station itself, breaching through sections where the hull had degraded and could no longer hold against them. The alarm klaxons wailed across all frequencies, and the Vox channels filled with panicked reports from officers who were watching their positions being overrun, and the command staff issued orders to fall back to secondary positions that had not been adequately prepared because we had never believed we would actually need them. I led my forces in retreat through corridors that were actively transforming around us, the walls flowing like liquid, the floor buckling and rising, and we fought running battles against enemies that appeared from impossible angles, shooting at things that should not have been able to exist in normal space. My soldiers died by the dozens, falling to weapons that unmade them on a molecular level or left them screaming as their bodies turned inside out, and I continued to give orders in a calm voice that came from somewhere outside myself, directing fields of fire and organizing tactical withdrawals and maintaining discipline through sheer force of habit, because discipline was all that separated us from the immediate collapse into chaos that was coming anyway, just slower. We reached the shrine complex because that was where the retreat led us, the corridors funneling us toward the station's core like water draining toward a plume hole. The priests were waiting, and they had transformed the shrine into a fortress, barricading the entrances and setting up firing positions among the icons and altars. We joined them because there was nowhere else to go, and together we prepared to make a final stand in a place of worship that smelled of incense and fear, and the peculiar sweet odor of corruption that I had learned meant something was very wrong on a level that went beyond the physical. The head priest, a man whose face was more scar tissue than flesh, told us that we would be saved if we had faith, that the Emperor protected the faithful, and I wanted to tell him that the Emperor had not protected anyone on this station since before I arrived, but I said nothing because faith was the last thing these people had, and I would not take it from them, even if it was a lie. The enemy reached the shrine complex within hours, and they came not as a wave but as a tide, filling the corridors and chambers with their presence, and we fought them with everything we had, our lasguns firing until the power packs depleted and the barrels glowed red, our flamers creating walls of fire that bought us seconds at best. The priests led prayers that rose above the sounds of combat, their voices hoarse but unwavering, and soldiers who had been dead-eyed veterans fell to their knees and prayed with them, their lips moving in perfect synchronization with words they had learned in childhood and forgotten until this moment. I fired my las pistol until it stopped working, discarded it, picked up a lasgun from a dead soldier, fired until that stopped working too, and then I fought with my hands, with a piece of broken metal I found on the ground, with my teeth when there was nothing else, and I killed until I no longer had the strength to kill, and then I somehow killed more. The end came not with a bang but with a whimper. The last of our defensive positions collapsing not because we stopped fighting but because there were simply too many of them and too few of us. I found myself backed into a corner of the shrine, surrounded by bodies that were both familiar and not. The faces of people I had commanded twisted in death into expressions that belonged to nightmares. The head priest was still alive, still praying, blood running from his mouth and nose but his voice never faltering, and around him the last soldiers maintained a perimeter that was shrinking with every second. The enemy pressed in, their weapons silent now, as if they had decided to conserve ammunition for later use, and they came at us with blades and claws and appendages that defied description, and we met them with empty hands and broken weapons, and the kind of desperate savagery that emerges when there is nothing left to lose. I do not remember the exact moment when I fell. I remember pain, sharp and then spreading, and I remember the feeling of my body hitting the cold stone floor, and I remember looking up at the vaulted ceiling of the shrine with its Gothic arches and its decorative skulls, and seeing that they were moving, that the stone itself was alive and watching, and had always been watching. I remember the head priest's prayer finally ending mid-word, and the sudden silence that followed was more terrible than any sound. I remember seeing the enemy standing over me, looking down with their too many eyes, and then moving on because I was no longer a threat, no longer even interesting, just another piece of broken meat to be processed by the servitors when they finally arrived. I am still alive. This is the part that I struggle to understand. The enemy withdrew, or perhaps they were satisfied, or perhaps they simply had other priorities, and when the relief forces finally arrived, days or weeks later, I was still lying in the corner of the shrine where I had fallen, surrounded by the dead. They found me with a pulse, barely, and they took me to the Medicae ward, and they repaired the damage to my body with techniques that are beyond my understanding, replacing organs that had failed and limbs that had been too damaged to save. I am now more augmetic than flesh. My right arm replaced with a mechanical prosthetic that clicks when I move it. My left leg rebuilt with synthetic muscles that never tire but never feel quite natural. I can see through my right eye with augmented clarity that shows me details I do not want to see, and I can hear through my left ear frequencies that make my skin crawl because they sound like the chanting from the shrine complex. They decorated me. This seems important to them, the act of giving me medals and commendations for surviving, as if survival itself were an accomplishment rather than the result of random chance and the enemy's indifference. They promoted me to major and gave me a staff position in the station's reconstructed command center, where I process reports from other defensive lines on other stations where soldiers are dying in the same meaningless patterns I survived. I read casualty reports with my augmented eye, and I see the names, and I know that behind each name is a person like I was, who had a life before this, and now has only service and fear, and the certainty of eventual death. I sign forms authorizing deployments and equipment transfers and medical discharges, and I do it with mechanical precision because that is all I am now, a machine that processes the bureaucracy of death. Bastion 794 is still operational. After a fashion, they repaired the void shields and restored power to most sections, and rebuilt the defensive lines with fresh troops who look at the veterans with expressions of hope and trust. I walk through the corridors sometimes, during hours when I should be sleeping but cannot, because sleep brings dreams of things I do not want to remember, and I see that the shrine complex is larger than it was before, that it has expanded to take up even more of the station, that the chanting is louder and the rituals are stranger. I see soldiers who survived the final attack, and they do not recognize me, their eyes looking through me as if I am not there, and I wonder if they see me at all, or if I died in that corner of the shrine, and everything since has been the dream of a corpse that does not know it is dead. I am writing this in my quarters, my mechanical hand moving across the data slate with inhuman precision, recording everything I remember with perfect clarity because my augmented brain does not forget anything anymore. Every moment stored in crystalline detail that I can replay whenever I close my eyes. I am writing this because someone should know what it is like to serve in the last defense line, what it does to a person to stand between humanity and the void, to watch everyone around you die while you survive, for no reason you can understand. I am writing this because I want there to be some record, some testament, some proof that we were here and that we mattered, even though I know this document will be filed and forgotten and lost in the vast archives of the Administratum where all things go to die. The next transport of conscripts arrived this morning, and I watched from a viewing port as they stumbled down the ramp onto the landing platform, their faces pale and their eyes wide with fear and hope. I wanted to tell them to run, to refuse service, to do anything except step onto this station that will consume them piece by piece until there is nothing left. But I did not. Because I am part of the machine now, and the machine does not care about individuals, only about function. I will process them through the standard procedures. I will assign them to squads and send them to the defensive lines. I will sign their death certificates when they die, and I will do it all with the same mechanical precision I apply to everything now, because that is what I have become. I sometimes wonder if the Emperor truly protects the faithful, or if protection is something we tell ourselves because the alternative is unbearable. I survived when better people died, and I can find no meaning in that survival, no divine plan that justifies my continued existence, while Tavik and the conscript whose name I never learned and the boy who died in my arms asking if he served well are all gone, processed by servitors and reduced to statistics in reports that no one reads. I think perhaps the Emperor does not protect, or if he does, his protection is so vast and impersonal that individual human suffering is beneath his notice, background radiation in a war that spans galaxies and millennia. The station hums around me, its machinery grinding on, its systems failing and being repaired and failing again in endless cycles. The void shields flicker, the atmospheric processors wheeze, the water pools in the low places, the rats swim through the darkness, the priests chant their prayers, and the enemy waits beyond the shields for the next opportunity to come through and kill us. This is what it is like to serve in the last defense line. This is what happens when you are taken from your life and fed into a machine that exists only to exist, that has forgotten its purpose but continues to function because no one has told it to stop. This is what it means to be a soldier of the Imperium, to have your humanity stripped away piece by piece until you are nothing but a collection of responses and reports and scars that will not heal. I will continue to serve because I have no choice, because the alternative is execution for dereliction of duty, because I am more machine than man now, and machines do not choose, they only function. I will stand watch over defensive lines and sign death certificates and process casualty reports and send young men and women to die in trenches full of black water, and I will do it until the enemy comes again and finishes what they started, or until the station finally collapses under its own weight, or until the administratum processes the paperwork to shut us down, and I am transferred to another installation where the same patterns will repeat themselves, because this is the Imperium, and this is what the Imperium does. The void shields are flickering again. I can see it from my window, the purple light pulsing irregularly, and I know what that means. The alarms will sound soon, and the Vox will crackle with coordinates and firing solutions, and soldiers will die in numbers that will be recorded and filed and forgotten, and I will survive, because apparently that is what I do, and my survival will become more obscene with each attack, more evidence that the universe operates on principles that have nothing to do with justice or mercy or sense. This is what it is like to serve in the last defense line. This is what it means to be part of humanity's defense against the darkness. This is how the Imperium protects itself, by feeding its sons and daughters into a meat grinder that never stops, that can never stop, that has become an end unto itself. And I am part of that machine now, indistinguishable from it. My humanity a distant memory like my life before the conscription, like the faces of the people I have commanded, like the hope I once had that service meant something. The alarms are sounding now. I should go to my post, fulfill my function, continue the cycle, but I am writing this last paragraph instead, because I need someone to know, even if that someone is just myself, even if these words are never read by anyone else, that I was human once, that I had a name and a life and dreams that did not involve standing in trenches full of black water and watching people die. I was a clerk in a manufactorum. I counted bolter shells. I had a future that extended beyond the next attack, beyond the next casualty report, beyond the next moment of survival that I do not deserve and cannot explain. My name is gone now, replaced by rank and serial number. My face is half augmetic. My memories are perfectly preserved in circuits that cannot forget, and I am still here, on Bastion 794, serving in the last defense line, waiting for the next attack that will kill everyone but me, because apparently that is my function in the Emperor's grand design. To survive, and to remember, and to write reports that no one will read about people who no one will mourn. This is what it is like. This is all it is like. This is everything.